kemi sot dhe jam shumë e nderuar që ta prezentoj para jush është Sir Geoffrey Nice. Sir Geoffrey Nice është aktualisht profesor në disa universitete, është ligjërues, gjithashtu vizitor në shumë universitete prestigjioze. Ne sot e kemi nderin që ta kemi këtu në Fakultetin Juridik. Dhe ajo që me siguri gjithë e dini, Sir Geoffrey Nice nuk është vetëm një ekspert i njohur i fushës të drejtës penale ndërkombëtare, nuk ka vetëm ekspertizë personale në Tribunalit Ndërkombëtare për krimet luftës, po Sir Geoffrey Nice është pjesë e historisë tonë. Sir Geoffrey Nice është pjesë e historisë të cilën jo vetëm ne kemi përjetuar, po është pjesë e historisë që gjenerata e gjenerata në të ardhmen do ta studiojnë punën e tij në tribunalin në ICTY në tribunalin e ish Jugosllavisë. Ne sot do të kemi rastin që të mësojmë më shumë edhe për përvojën e tij personale në ndërtimin e Aktakuzës dhe nxjerrjen e Aktakuzës kundër Milosheviqit. Është gjithashtu një moment shumë i rëndësishëm për ne këtu, sepse ne si shtet jemi duke kaluar në për disa sfida të jetë rëndësishme, sepse para nesh kemi gjithashtu ndërtimin e një të ashtu quajturi ad hoc tribunali, edhe pse në emërtimin e vet juridik janë vetëm dhoma të specializuara të gjyqësorit tonë dhe të prokurorisë sonë. Kështu që çdo pyetje që e keni, ju lutem bëhuni të hapur dhe mos hezitoni që pas ligjëratës të shtroni pyetje të cilat vërtet e ndini se dëshironi të dëgjoni përgjigjen nga Sir Geoffrey Nice. Gjithashtu, bashkë si pjesë e ekipit është edhe profesoresha Nena Trump, që vjen nga Universiteti i Amsterdamit dhe që ka përvojë gjatë në sektorin e hetimeve, që ka punu bashkë me Sir Geoffrey Nicein në ndërtimin e Aktakuzës kundër Milosheviqit. Ju falemnderit shumë për pjesëmarrje. Sir Geoffrey, please, you have a floor.
If you can't hear me, put your hands up. Shall I speak louder? Does that make a difference? Do you want me to sit down? Okay. I can do that, but then I've got the machine here. We'll see. I'll sit for a bit and stand occasionally. If I speak too fast, will you promise to tell me? Feel free to interrupt and ask questions as we go along. And if you ask too many, we'll stop you, but feel completely free. Just a couple of minutes first of personal history, not because I want to talk about myself, but to give context to what follows. I came to the law almost by chance after university, where I studied philosophy and politics. My approach to life was in part, or large part, formed by parents who held socialist views, my father a trades unionist who believed that putting the fairness to others and fighting the battles of others was something that had to be high on his and indeed on my mother's agenda. And that approach, that the law should deliver something that is fair, has inevitably been an approach very hard for me to throw off. None of us can throw off our parents' attitudes very easily, and I didn't want to throw theirs off. After 27 years of practicing in various areas of law, but a lot of criminal law in England with reasonable but no special success, I joined the ICTY, the Yugoslav Tribunal, to prosecute what was then the largest case, although hardly known of now, the case of two Bosnian Croats, Dario Kordic and Mario Cerkes. And I also prosecuted the first genocide case at the tribunal to reach a conclusion. How many law students are there here? Hands up. Who knows what was the first ICTY genocide case to reach a conclusion? Goran Jelisic, who killed in quite substantial numbers at the town of Brčko. I finished that case and returned to England in 2001, and then went back to prosecute Milosevic until he died in 2006. And I've worked almost exclusively in the same area of law, often advising governments, sometimes representing individuals, and sometimes representing pro bono victim groups who can't be represented in any other way. How has my process of aging, set within this relatively recent professional experience, adjusted my view of the world that I was brought up to hope would be dealt with by the law in a way that made things fair or fairer? And I suppose it's worth just having in mind, as I try and set the scene and then come down to the detail, that none of us humans are volunteers. We come to be born as a result of a strong act, and we end our lives often enough in pain and unhappiness. And we hope that the middle bit, as we tell ourselves, will be lived in peace and harmony. For those whose middle bit, whose lives between birth and death are not peaceful and content, we say that we wish they could have lived in peace. And nowadays we say to them that we will try and deal with their misfortune by processes of justice. We express the very general hope that people who suffer as a result of being involved in armed conflicts will be reconciled and will be able in some constructive way to put the misery. Our modern legal processes achieve this. The processes are, and we have to remember this, very, very new. The default position, to use a modern term, default, the default position over centuries and millennia for people caught up in armed conflict was that once the conflict was over, the winning party would take everything. Maybe slaughter the defeated, rule them, and what's more, would write the history of the conflict to show that the victor was also in the right. But that is an immensely new, that's the default position, and it has only very, very recently changed. Incidentally, Shakespeare puts this matter, for those of you interested, well in a small extract from Henry VI, Part 3, where somebody seeking the crown is about to be killed. And the killer says to him, "It's war's prize, it is the prize of war, to take all advantages." And he goes on to say, "And 10 to 1 is no impeach of valor," which I take to mean that even if you win because you just have overwhelming force, doesn't mean you can't say you're brave, doesn't mean you can't rewrite history. in the way you want it to be written. Now, in your legal studies, those of you who are studying law, you will understand that the present position is that following conflicts, there are all sorts of interventions, not just legal interventions, judicial interventions. There are also humanitarian interventions and political interventions from outside bodies, each seeking to achieve something, either for the people, as they would say, or for themselves, or for the juggling of the position of the parties who were once involved in the conflict. And that's perhaps something that's very pertinent, very important for what's happening here in Kosovo. As a result of all these interventions, but particularly the legal ones, a change from the default position, which is if you're beaten, you just have to put up with what comes your way. If you win, you can do whatever you like. A consequence of the change is that people who are on the defeated side, or in the course of conflict, suffer grave loss, is that they have great expectations. And sometimes those expectations are not met. And one of the reasons we have, I and I think Nena too, have these issues perhaps at the forefront of our mind is that we have just come from a conference in Sarajevo dealing with the genocide at Srebrenica, which happened 20 years ago. The purpose of the conference was to deal with how this particular genocide should be remembered. But in hearing all the contributions, one couldn't help but ask the question, particularly of those most affected, the bereaved of the 8,000 men and boys killed at Srebrenica. One couldn't help ask the question, well, to begin with, when the Yugoslav tribunal came into being, their hopes were high, and they may have been satisfied by what the tribunal did. They may have been satisfied by what another court, the International Court of Justice, did. But over time, their expectations have not been realized, and they have become disappointed. And one has to ask whether one of the possible consequences of this high level of intervention that happens with courts and in other ways, one of the consequences is that the process of suffering is actually extended. I can't answer these questions because I've never been a victim and I'm only a lawyer. But they're among the many issues that arise as all of us now look at what has happened by the introduction of criminal tribunals that deal with the aftermath of wars. Now, for Kosovo, this problem, you may think, is quite interesting, but also quite serious. Kosovo was, how would you describe it? On the winning side, with the international force? Would that be a fair summary? Nod or shake your head? Okay, what would it be then?
So this is the case when...
No, but were you on, in the conflict,
yeah,
were you on the victorious side? That's all we need for the time being.
I think we were in the winning side, right, in the conflict.
Sir?
By conflicts, by wars, anything, like conflicts, yeah, or sides of it, there are no victories, there are no winners.
That's also true.
Yeah.
But would any of you, until recently, would any of you have regarded yourselves as on the losing side? After all, you declared independence, you were successful in the challenge to that declaration of independence by one court, the International Court of Justice. And although you haven't been recognized by the United Nations or by Europe yet, you're on a steady path to further recognition. So that you have many of the signs of being the victorious sides, however small you are as a country. And yet, as has already been indicated, you are having to face that which normally happens to the losing side, because you're being compelled to contemplate further investigation for particular alleged offences, the processing of which may, in a different way from the way suffered by, say, the mothers of Srebrenica, but may extend your difficulties and not shorten the process of the new Kosovo coming into being. So these new courts and everything that happens surrounding them are I say that these events are all very new, and I won't take time to go into it in detail, but those of you who are lawyers will already know. Those of you who are not lawyers can know in summary that until the middle of the 19th century, there was really nothing by way of regulation of armed conflict. It starts in the middle of the 19th century, develops at the end of the century with various conventions. There were consideration given to trying the defeated after the First World War for war crimes, and a very limited number of war crimes trials happened. Then after the Second World War, there were war crimes trials in Germany and in Tokyo, but only of the defeated side. There was then a pause of 30 years until the 40 years, until the war crimes tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda were set up, and then the permanent court was set up much later. So it's very, very recent, both the law and the practice. And Giulietta, your dean, asked me to say something about the realities of working in these courts. And without elaborating and going into too much detail, it is true that these modern courts are subject to pressures that an ordinary domestic court should not suffer. If you take a well-functioning domestic legal system, and there are some, none of them is perfect, but some of them are reasonably good, then the system will have structural controls that mean the judges are independent and cannot be bought, and that the lawyers are independent and cannot be subject to improper pressure, that the law is laid down probably by some entirely separate party, the legislature, in a public way, and that the lawyers, the courts, the judges, apply the law in an objective, a dispassionate way. That's what should happen. And although, as I say, no system is perfect, it is possible to organize systems, domestic systems, so that that happens reasonably satisfactorily, so that the public are not up in arms thinking that the legal system is wrong. And when they want to change the legal system, they write to their member of parliament and get him to try and change the law, and he either succeeds or she succeeds or they don't. International criminal courts are very different. They were set up by politicians for very specific purposes, or sometimes with very oblique purposes. For example, some would say that the Rwanda tribunal and even the Yugoslav tribunal were set up because of international guilt at failings of the international community to do in other ways what should have been done to reduce or avoid the conflict. Let's assume that's the case. It doesn't mean that the outcome, the performance of the court has to be bad. On the contrary, badly motivated or improperly motivated things can often work very well. And indeed, in many ways, the Yugoslav tribunal with which I'm acquainted worked very well. I'll come to that in more detail later. But it would be unsurprising if the politicians who have created these courts with very specific mental processes should be content simply to leave them alone and not interfere with them. It would be asking, you may think, a bit too much of any politician. And the truth is that at the moment, these modern courts are subject to very significant, not very significant, sometimes to very significant, and sometimes to slight, and sometimes to no pressure of a kind that must be recognized and dealt with. To give you just some very well-known examples, not from this tribunal, the Yugoslav tribunal, in Cambodia, where the regime of the Khmer Rouge were tried, after there'd been one trial, there was the most immense pressure put on the court to have no more trials. It was completely improper pressure. It was because the government of the day included, I think, people from the Khmer Rouge, or was connected to them. Eventually it was resolved and there have been more trials, but very great pressure, quite wrong. More famously, in the Rwanda tribunal, which, as lawyers and non-lawyers may know, involved fight between Hutus and Tutsis, where the Hutus were the major villains, but where it was said that the Tutsis had also committed war crimes, it has proved impossible to investigate properly, let alone to prosecute any Tutsis, because the most direct pressure was applied to the court by President Kagame, on the basis of which the court either did what it was told, or it would be run out of office and they wouldn't have jobs, they wouldn't have pensions and all that sort of thing that go with being a lawyer in these courts. So there are plenty of examples, apart from the Yugoslav tribunal, where pressure has been applied. And we mustn't be surprised, we mustn't be naive, we mustn't expect the perfect. In the Yugoslav tribunal, the following are examples of the sort of things that actually happened. And I can tell you about them because I was there. To take one example, and it may seem a surprising thing for non-lawyers and lawyers alike, at the end of the prosecution's case, the presiding judge became obviously extremely ill, and indeed he died not very long afterwards. And once his ill health was understood and appreciated, it became absolutely essential to decide whether the hearings could continue at all with the remaining two judges. But the rule was that the case could only go with two judges, and then only for 5 days, if the third judge was absent for a reason that wouldn't last very long. But this judge was very, very ill and was never going to sit as a judge again. And the court decided that it would be a public relations gain to have 5 more days of hearings with 2 judges in order to bring the prosecution's case to an end. So, a sort of fairly small event, a small issue. Milosheviqit was entitled to know whether the hearings that were being planned by the court were lawful, because he could have objected. And the court put the most immense pressure on those of us prosecuting to suppress from Milosevic all information that would have allowed him to argue, no, the hearings must stop. Now you may think, who cares about Milosevic? And what's more, Milosevic might have said, well, who cares about one ill judge? You can have these hearings if you like. But under any legal system, if you have rules and regulations, they have to be complied with. And so on this occasion, despite the comparative modesty, smallness of the issue, despite the immense pressure put on us, it had to be dealt with, turned round. Milosevic had to be adequately informed. But let's now turn to something rather more substantial. In the course of the evidence, we became completely certain, indeed anybody can be certain, that at the time of the killings at Srebrenica, after the 11th of July on 1995, Milosevic had been in telephone contact with General Mladic. We knew that for several reasons, but we knew it because we had Milosevic's own words recorded stenographically and also tape recorded in documents provided to us that said they'd been in contact. Obviously, it would have helped us, wouldn't it, prosecuting the case, to know what Milosevic said. Might have shown that he was more guilty than we'd thought. It might have shown that he was less guilty. He might have said, get on with it, Mladic, as it were, or he might have said, for goodness sake, don't do anything that you are doing. We just didn't know. But we needed to know what he said. We also knew that there were intercepts of those phone calls. So you will not be surprised whether you're lawyers, journalist students, social science students, you won't be surprised to know that we, the lawyers prosecuting the case, really wanted to get our hands and our ears onto those intercepts. And we very nearly did. But not quite. Because we were stopped by an outside force, identity of which I cannot give you, that simply walked into the prosecutor's office and said, do not apply to get those intercepts. Why do you think that might have been? Why do you think that might have been? Well, it might have been because it was hoped that we wouldn't have the best evidence. But let's put that aside. Let's assume the evidence, whichever way it went, we still don't know, would have helped the case because it would have made the case fuller. What other reason could there be, do you think, for any external force stopping me and my colleagues getting hold of, listening to, understanding and using intercepts of a conversation between Mladic and Karadzic on about, I think, the 13th of July. I'll be corrected if I'm wrong. It might lead to other cases. That's possible. Anybody else? Thank you. Well, the most unattractive outcome is this, isn't it? That if the intercepts showed what knowledge was available to the international community, at the time this worst of all European massacres since World War II was in progress, who would then have had responsibility thrown on them? The international community itself. And although we don't know, and we must avoid conspiracy theories whenever we can, that is certainly a possibility. Another and very famous example that we've talked about perhaps over the years too much is the Supreme Defense Council records, which were records of a three-man presidency, not presidency, a three presidents meeting, which explained exactly how Serbia supported the Bosnian Serbs in the conflict, stenographically recorded, provided to us with the best bits, or should I say the worst bits, all blacked out. And that, it became clear, was as a result of an agreement made between the Yugoslav tribunal's prosecutor and the international and the Serbs themselves. And that was extremely unfortunate, because although we could see what was there, the public couldn't. And when another court came to deal with the case of Bosnia against Serbia, that's the International Court of Justice, they chose to rely on the blacked out documents and not to read what was available. So these pressures exist, and we may deal with one or two others of them in questions if and when you have any questions on that topic. But let me not suggest that the tribunals, which are new, untried, bound to be making mistakes and so on, are in any way unsuccessful. There are, it is true, some verdicts of the court that have been controversial, but for the most part, the verdicts of the court have, I think, been tested on appeal and probably will be found to be satisfactory in the long term. Second, and some would say even more significant, there have been many cases where an enormous amount of evidence has been made available that would never have come to light but for the facts of the trials themselves. And in the case of Milosevic, with which of course you are concerned in the same way as you are probably also concerned with the cases of Milutinovic and Djordjevic, if you're interested in the history of the conflict here in Kosovo, in his case, he represented himself. So in the questions he asked and in the speeches he made, although he never gave evidence, he explained exactly what his position was and has left behind for historians and researchers of all kinds a mass of material that would never have come available but for the process of the trial, and that should, we would hope, one would hope, make it more difficult for future generations of political bad doers, people who want to do bad things, to misuse the record of the trial, to misstate it, because it's there, it's extensive, cross-examination of all the witnesses by Milosevic there to explain his position. So these trials, which are of course being replicated nowadays in other courts and indeed in the permanent criminal court, so-called permanent criminal court, to which I can turn maybe if we have time, the same thing is happening. Evidence is being made available, including by governments who hate making evidence available. They prefer to keep everything close to their chests if they can. Evidence is being made available that wouldn't otherwise ever come to light. And there have been some remarkable and remarkably interesting developments in the trials, and it seems, as well as leaving you with rather solemn faces looking a bit glum, I should provide you with a couple of moments of, not light-hearted, because there's nothing very light-hearted in these cases, but with a couple of things of interest from the evidence that I and my colleagues were able to explore. And I think I've got some pictures, but we'll wait and see. Not like that. Needn't worry about that. How do I get it to go down? Oh, that'll do. This one. These are things I wasn't going to tell you about. But this one is an extraordinarily interesting piece of evidence. The picture isn't terribly good, but the man you're looking at is a man called General Obrad Stevanović. Who's ever heard of him? I ask the question not because you should have heard of him, but because one of the realities, is it me you're waving at? Okay, somebody in there. Because one of the realities of conflict is that memory of conflict fades very rapidly. And the second generation, as you in a sense are, most of you, will know very little of what happened. Now, General Obrad Stevanović was a Serbian police general and is currently, I believe, a Serbian professor in the police academy. You will, I think, all know to some degree that following the killings here in Kosovo, in various places, including in Peć, bodies were buried, then they were dug up, put in lorries, and driven a very great distance north to places in Serbia where they were reburied. But one lorry landed up in the Danube? The Danube, yeah. And was found with its awful contents. Following that, eventually, graves were found in Serbia. They're called secondary graves, although they're sometimes tertiary, third-level graves. Secondary graves where bodies that have been buried have been dug up, moved, and reburied. And it was possible to connect by DNA and other techniques the bodies found in Serbia with people who had been killed here in Kosovo. Let's just break off there, and for the lawyers, here's a test for the lawyers. In any criminal case, whether it's burglary or shoplifting or murder, domestic case, what are the two things that have to be proved against a defendant? Latin will do on this occasion, if you know the Latin. Well, see if I can help you. First of all, you have to prove that the defendant concerned did the act. What else do you have to prove? Sorry? Yeah, what do you have to prove in addition to proving that he did the thing, killed the person, took the Sorry? Knowledge. What else? Actus reus and mens rea. The Latin terms mean you do the thing, or the thing that is done, thank you very much, sir, and that you had the mental state. Mental state for shoplifting, burglary, robbery, domestic murder is comparatively easy to talk about, and sometimes very easy to prove, sometimes very difficult to prove, but nevertheless you know what it is you're talking about. For a war crime, where remember war can be lawful, it can be much more difficult. General Obrad Stevanović kept a notebook. Now, I'm afraid I don't have the version that shows this in English, and it's not really very legible, I suspect, on the screen. But I am corrected by Nena Tromp, if I get it wrong, will tell you what this succession of pages actually shows us and showed the court. This notebook came into our possession before we knew that Obrad Stevanović would be a witness. He was called by the defendant, which meant under the adversarial system of trial that we were operating, that I was in the happy position of being able to ask him questions. And since this document was in his own hand, I could ask him about what he wrote. And what he wrote in this sequence of pages outlined there amounts to the following. He writes down, no bodies, no crime. And it was possible to understand that no bodies, no crime was associated with the movement of the bodies from Kosovo to Serbia. Remember, if it had been a lawful battle, there would be no need to move the dead bodies of the other side's soldiers, whatever respect you might wish to show them. But best of all in this sequence of documents, and right at the top of the page, there is a reference to, was it President's office? In questioning, Stevanovic was obliged to agree that that was a reference to where this conversation about no bodies, no crime took place, and that the president was President Milosevic. So here we had that unusual piece of evidence that showed the plan to move the bodies and to show that it was done for a purpose, no bodies, no crimes, to hide the crimes, and that it happened in the place of the man who was on trial and who was, of course, chairing the meeting. Moments like that in these big trials are unusual, but this was an absolutely extraordinarily exciting moment for us, as you can imagine. There was another moment with this particular witness of great significance, which was in respect of, I think I've got it here, not there, we'll move on from that, and we'll come back to that, but I think, sorry about this, I didn't get these sorted out quite in time. Can you see? Yes, here we are. This has to do again with Srebrenica. The problem for the prosecution was to connect Milosevic, who was president of Serbia, with the acts of, was it something I said? Was to connect Milosevic, who was president of Serbia, with what was being done by Bosnian Serbs in Bosnia, and in particular with what was happening in Srebrenica. And for lawyers, there has to be something wryly, W-R-Y-L-Y, I'm never quite sure how you defined wryly, but wryly ironic in the material that came into our possession, which was a very long video. And it started with pictures like this, where the troop of paramilitaries called the Scorpions were blessed by the priest standing on the left, each approaching the priest, taking off the beret to be blessed, as this chap is here, filmed face on, so that almost unimaginably for a criminal activity, we had everyone of this group whose criminal acts we were to become concerned with, providing a photograph as good as you get when you've already been accused and you've gone to the police station and they make you stand against the wall and take your picture. We had perfect ID of everyone in the group. But as some of you, certainly the older ones amongst you, will know, the awful thing that happened was that this troop went on to photograph themselves, killing 6 very young men and boys, very young chaps, from the Srebrenica 8,000, a long way away, southeast of Sarajevo. I won't show you the pictures from that because they're not entirely happy. Not at all happy. And what was significant was that this troop, the Scorpions, were a Serb force. They answered to Serbia, and indeed we could argue that they answered to none other than General Obrad Stevanović, the man who'd already had difficulties with his diary. And what was rewarding for us was that a very difficult exercise worked out not just in the way we sort of hoped it would, but worked out unexpectedly well. For us, we wanted to get this video in because it showed, better than any other piece of evidence would have shown, that Serbia had direct responsibility for killing people who were taken away from Srebrenica. And that would fix the management chain, the line of command, not just into the territory of the Bosnian Serbs, but into Belgrade itself. And so what we wanted to do, and I was able to do it, was to play a very small part of this video, because I knew I'd be stopped by the court if I played a large part, to the witness and ask him, well, can you help us with identifying these people who are committing these killings, because they're actually in a unit that answers to the Department of State of which you are a leader or the leader. We managed to play a bit of the film. I'll just show you perhaps one bit of it. That's the beginning where they were about to kill the young chaps. Oh, sorry, go back. And there's the lorry in which they were brought. And what was immensely interesting was that we, having played the small part in court, somebody in Belgrade who held the whole film and had done nothing with it until then, decided to get it played at last, you might think, on television, or get it played somewhere. And that had an immense effect on whether the Serbs of Serbia accepted that Srebrenica was a real event and not simply something by way of propaganda. And so this was an example of how not only did the process of an international criminal court allow evidence to be presented in one way or another to the judges and in part to the public, because this evidence curiously never became technically evidence of the case itself, but how it could actually have a dramatic effect upon the public at large. The last bit of evidence that I'll tell you about, although I've talked about it so many times, I wonder when I will stop, but it is such an important piece of evidence. And it goes to show again something about how criminal trials generally and how international criminal court trials in particular have to operate. And also tells us something about the man Milosheviqit. It is a piece of evidence that was located by someone in the prosecution team for what it was. It was understood for what it was. And let's get back to it. No, can you get back to it for me? It's back. I know. Sorry about this, ladies and gentlemen. But talk amongst yourselves. I'm looking for Këtë. Yeah, there we are. Now this was a video that came into our possession, and it really it covers every aspect almost of the good things that can happen in these trials. Although there was an unfortunate bad thing that happened with this exhibit, but we won't perhaps focus on that. First of all, it was an exhibit that was available, had been missed by people in the team, was looked at again, and was then seen for what it was. And it was immediately recognized that this was an immensely valuable piece of evidence. It's a video of 1998. 7. Thank you. And it shows a memorial and a celebration where Milosevic, who you can dimly see on the right, you can see on the right hand of these 3 slides, attends an event celebrating their creation by a group known as the Red Berets. The Red Berets had operated in Croatia and Bosnia at a time when those countries had declared their independence. They'd committed crimes. There was no way Serbia could have lawfully created a paramilitary group or a group of this kind to operate in other countries or in other parts of the former Yugoslavia. And what happened here was Milosevic, who never wore a uniform himself so far as we could see, avoided contact with the military, or certainly didn't embrace contact, had turned up in 1997 to a celebration where he's seen shaking hands with the leaders of the group. Indeed, he's heard saying to one of the mid-level commanders, "I read your reports." He's shown on the wall a map of all the places where the group had operated, and the group thanked him for having created them in 1991, effectively. Now, obviously, it's an interesting piece of film, but it's so much more than that. Because, to pick up what the gentleman said over there about what you need to prove for a crime, actus reus and mens rea, topics easy enough to discuss for the domestic murderer, the domestic burglar, but for heads of state or prime ministers running or involved in conflicts in neighboring states, where they might or might not have direct control, where they might or might not do this or that, much more difficult. Because no leader says, okay, I'm about to go and do something unlawful. They just don't do that sort of thing. It does not happen. And if they do something unlawful, they try and obscure it. But here, Milosevic had, on the telling of this video, revealed that in 1991, he did something that no leader could possibly justify, because if you release paramilitaries into people's territories, you disturb the peace. Apart from just committing the crimes, you disturb the peace, you allow conflicts to continue where they otherwise might not, you serve the interests of the particular party you're supporting, and so on and so forth. And to do this, to set up this unit, he must have known at the time that he was acting in a way that was completely unlawful. And here we come back to the point I made earlier about the real value, or one particular aspect of the real value of these international criminal tribunals, whatever people think of the verdicts and how long the cases take and all that sort of thing. What do you think? Oh, let's ask another question. What does a defendant who is completely guilty of some domestic crime do when he's challenged with it? What does he do? A one-word answer will probably suffice. Denies it. He denies it. He lies about it. Because there's nothing he can say to get round it. He's completely guilty, and he's either got to confess, which he doesn't want to do, or he lies about it. Milosevic, presented with this evidence and choosing to ask questions on his own behalf because he had no lawyer, had to say something about it. And what he said about it was that it hadn't happened at all, or that it related to a different day, or that it was never created in 1991. All that sort of stuff. And therefore, his very clear lie, even though he wasn't given evidence, goes to show that he had a completely guilty mind. He knew. And we were always looking for what was the first bit of evidence in time that showed this was a guilty man. And in a way, this was the best bit of evidence of the earliest date that showed May of 1991, that showed he knew that he wasn't just reacting as the leader of a state posed with particular difficulties. He was acting criminally. And by criminally, we mean criminally in terms of international law and the conduct of warfare. So that was another exciting piece of evidence, and I hope you found the bits of evidence we've referred to at least interesting, but also showing how complex the process of dealing with war crimes is compared with an ordinary domestic case. And my experience was not just as it had been when I was a regular advocate in England, that the lawyer instructing me, or if I had a junior lawyer, the junior lawyer or the police officer would have really good ideas, which I had the good fortune of being able to reduce into propositions or questions or whatever. But in the international setting, lawyers are wholly dependent on other members of their team. It has to be teamwork. Working out what these, for example, these videos meant was sometimes well beyond the ability of the ordinary police investigator. It required people with a range of skills, researchers with not just language skills, but also with understanding of geography, and in other circumstances, understanding of culture. And so the business of prosecuting these cases was at its best an immense team effort. And I think that's a particularly important thing to have in mind, not least as we look, and perhaps I'll end on this, with genocide. Sometimes lawyers get the reputation, those of you who are studying law try and avoid it, for being stuck up and superior and thinking they know it all when they very clearly don't. But in domestic courts, they can sometimes get away with it, and they don't have to involve other people. In this sort of work, you have to involve everyone if you're to do the job at all. And the product of your work will be the product of everyone. And in a curious way, you can say, whatever the future of these courts, because we don't know whether they'll survive in principle or not, we can talk about that perhaps in questions, but in a way, the project of prosecuting war crimes becomes a sort of people's project. It's not. I mean, it's the work of an office, but the office includes a large number of people working together, and that's a very good thing. And it has resulted in the case of Kosovo, in particular in the Milutinovic case, and also the Đorđević case, in some maybe very satisfactory from the point of view of Kosovo results. But very recently, and I will end on this, we've been thinking a bit more about genocide. And without troubling non-lawyers or lawyers with the details of this, the crime of genocide, which was first identified after the Second World War, the term only coming into existence in the course of the Second World War. The crime of genocide is somewhat problematic from a lawyer's point of view. From a lawyer's point of view, you could say, actually, this crime is troublesome, and it might be better to deal with things that are charged as genocide by way of charging them as crimes against humanity. That would be one of the things that the lawyers may find themselves debating in their studies here in your university. And it's a live and important issue. But in a way, we've moved beyond what the lawyers left when they drafted the Genocide Convention in 1948, or when the crime was cast as genocide in the Yugoslav Tribunal or the Rwanda Tribunal or the Statute of the International Criminal Court. Because the term now is used by members of the public around the world and has a public meaning. Public meaning may not be exactly the same as the lawyer's meaning. And there may be occasions when the public will think this was definitely genocide, and the lawyers will not be able to prove it because of the technical definition that there is of genocide. But the lawyers can't now take away from the public, at least not for the time being, this term as a term they use and want to use and should be allowed to use. And it is interesting to note right now that in the case of Bosnia, there was a verdict against the state of Serbia brought at the International Court of Justice by Bosnia. That genocide had happened in and around Srebrenica, but that Serbia was not guilty in an active way of genocide. And that verdict is still regarded by Bosnians as entirely unsatisfactory. And it's up to the Bosnians whether they ever get around to taking the steps they can take, probably in the next year or so, to try and put that right. What happened in that case, and also in another case involving Croatia and Serbia, where they each tried to allege genocide against each other and each failed, is that maybe countries were using the courts to try and leave a record of genocide as part of the country's history, because of course court records become usable as part of the history of a country, even if they're not history writing themselves. And one of the issues that has been raised, and that I mentioned without expressing a view on it, is that Kosovo's suffering can, as readily as Bosnia's, be described by the term genocide. And one of the issues that all states emerging from conflicts have to deal with is whether they are going to be passive in how their history is left, or whether they're going to be active. And thus it is, I think, that in your country the issue of whether genocide should be raised, even at this stage, against Serbia in the International Court of Justice has now been raised as an issue for consideration. And thus my little explanation of the surrounding history. But ladies and gentlemen, I've gone on for a long time, and you've been very good at staying quiet, except when I've asked you to speak, and then you've been reasonably good at answering questions. So I bet it's time I asked you some more, or perhaps you'd like to ask me some. Or Nena.
So Geoffrey Nice, first of all, let me thank you again for your time today and for sharing with us some of your experience, some of your very valuable experience, especially for us as Kosovan new lawyers of tomorrow. As you already know, the results of war 1999 in Kosovo, Serbian-Kosovo war, are over hundreds of raped women, Kosovo women, over 1,600 lost victims whose families are still patiently waiting to know the destiny of their lost family members, and over 10,000 unguilty civils, including children, women, old people. And in this case, if you treat my following question from the human aspect, not from only from a professional one, do you think all these victims are satisfied from the work of Tribunal Hagë, the International Tribunal Court of Hagë, even when we take in chance the unfortunately unfinished prosecute of Milosheviqit? And in this case, as a second question, how many people are judged for all these damaged, for all these victims from this war? Thank you very much.
I don't think I can give you the statistical answer to the question how many, but maybe others can. I accept that that's a fair conclusion. That would be a very generous act for somebody who feels that they've suffered to make. But the reality is that these courts, if they're going to work at all, can only ever try a limited number of people, and they don't pretend otherwise. Trials of other defendants can be dealt with by local courts, and we hope that they will be. But the international courts simply can't try everyone. They've cost an immense amount of money. Some people would say more money than was ever expected, money that could be spent in another way. And the duty of trying others really has to come home.
Yes. Sharing your time. I just want to shift the perspective. Also, it is regard to the tribunal work. We all know the tribunal was aware for the serious allegations that were made publicly open from the former chief prosecutor, Carla Del Ponte, regarding the other criminal activities that were committed allegedly in Kosovo. And we all know that the tribunal never took an open investigation toward it. Was it because you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of political pressure toward the tribunal? Was it due to political pressure? Or was it, as you said earlier, sometimes the colleagues don't cooperate in some certain issues? So was it due to that? Thank you.
First of all, I think this topic's being dealt with this afternoon or this evening at 5 o'clock, 1700 hours, elsewhere in a public round table. Second, to pick up your last point, you may be speaking from information where you say that colleagues within these large organizations don't necessarily share information. That may well be true. On this particular case, all I can say really at the moment is as follows, that there's been a lot of material, or a significant amount of material, that has been leaked publicly, and that there is no reason to doubt the integrity of the papers that have been copied, that have been leaked. There are 32 pages of the investigation in 2003, and there's the full version of the scientific examination of the material found in Albania at what's been called the Yellow House, then or thereabouts. And an interesting feature of this history is that those documents were considered by the prosecutor at the ICTY, and it was found that there was simply no case to answer. There was nothing there. It was later, in 2007-8, when the prosecutor published her memoirs, that the allegations were revived, but not apparently on the basis of additional material. So that's really all I can say in answer to that part of your question. If this court comes into being, the special chambers comes into being, and if there are trials concerned with organ harvesting, as it's being called, then we'll discover if there was in fact additional material. But at the moment, no material additional to that, which was the subject of a decision not to prosecute, has been revealed, so far as I'm aware.
Falenderoj për zemërsisht për praninë e juaj, për Fakultetin Juridik është një respekt, një njohje. Fakulteti sigurisht ju ka njoftuar dekania mushkolle që Fakulteti Juridik tash këtë vit i mbush 55 vjet punë, përvojë, dhe lidhur me këtë ju them se Fakultetin Juridik që 20 vite ligjërohet lënda drejta penale ndërkombëtare, për që unë me ato njohuritë mia modeste mundohem që sa më afër, sa më interesantit nga bëj këtë kënd, dhe mund vjen shumë mirë që edhe këta studentët e ri janë shumë të kyçur në këtë lami, për shkak se është shumë aktuale dhe gjithherë do të jetë perspektive. Unë e kam di që ka ndikime gjykatat penale ndërkombëtare, por edhe nga ligjërata ju i vërtet doli që ka shumë, ma shumë se që unë kam menduar. Lidhur me këtë, do t'ju bëja një pyetje, a ka mundësi që të evitohen ose s'paku të minimizohen maksimalisht to presione, ndikime e tjera, që kështë me qenë pyetja e parë. Pyetja e dytë lidhur me gjenocidin ka aty mjaft dilema. Unë isha me një simpozium në Zagreb që pa të organizuar Tribunali Hagës. Mes tjerash, një ish prokurore tha se qëndrimi gjykatës penale ndërkombëtare është se për të u konsiderue krimi i gjenocidit do që një mas e konsiderushme e asaj popullat ose grupi etnik ose grupi fetar të jetë vratje, të asgjasutjet. Kjo është mjaft dubioze, mjaft e papërcaktuar e tjerë në lidhur me këtë, se vërtet unë e di që e drejta penale ndërkombëtare është në ndërtim e sipër, në formësim e sipër. Ka mangësi, ka zbrasti, ka dilema, po mirë thot një profesor i Zagrebit që edhe për kundër këtyre mangësive, ma mirë të jetë kjo drejtësi ndërkombëtare me këto të meta, se sa po mos ishte fare. Besoj se edhe për këtë pajtohem. Për ndryshe, t'ju them se ne kosovarët kemi një respekt dhe shumë e respektojmë dhe besojmë në drejtësinë ndërkombëtare, ma shumë se në drejtësinë vendore, penale. Ju tash fundi, më falni se pak e gjata, po vetëm e këtë. Ju dini se tash shpeti do të themelohet një gjykat herë thojnë speciale, herë specializuar, herë e tjera. Unë kam pas rastin me lexue versionin e parë të statutit të kësaj gjykate. Atë që dhe si mas asaj atyre njërive të mia modeste, më doli që 95% ose 98% e neneve, paragrafeve, instituteve, tjera, ishte sigur i Tribunalit Hagës. Nuk e di, çka mendoni ju për këtë, pse është, si e shihni këtë gjykate speciale të cilën tash bisedu më para se më ardhju me zonin Biserka, që është një aktiviste humaniste që ka një autoritet madh këtu në mesin tonë, edhe kjo ishte mendimi që këto farë krimet që pretendohet që janë kry gjatë luftës, kanë mund me krye Tribunali Hagës, se ka pas pikrisht këtë jurisdikcion, ose eventualisht dhe këto gjykas që kolegjit të gjykatave të Unmikut dhe tani të Euleksit. I falenderoj shumë edhe njëherë për prezencën edhe për ligjëratën e ju shumë interesante për ne. Për ndryshe unë e du shumë drejtën penale ndërkombëtare.
I'll answer. Thank you, Professor, for your questions, which I'll answer briefly. Picking one out of the middle, the notion that you have to have a large number of people killed to make genocide is, I think, poor law. It may be as a matter of practice that you only ever will land up indicting where there are a large number of people killed, but it's not what the law says. You can probably, as has happened once in a trial in Germany with a man called Djordjevic, you can actually try a man for a single crime if he has the relevant mental intent for genocide. So that's that. As to the special chambers, it is quite clearly the case that if these matters were within, and most of them would appear to have been within the remit of the ICTY, then subject to the fact that the Security Council stopped the ICTY preferring any additional indictments after a certain period of time, then there was no reason why these matters shouldn't have been dealt with within the ICTY. Coming back to your first question, which is, I think, a very important one, how do you change things so that courts of this kind are less subject to improper pressure? Let me say at once, as the late Judge May used to say to me very intelligently when he was criticizing me or he thought I was criticizing him, he said, it's always easy to criticize somebody else in the way they do their job. And he was right. But having made that concession, I think there would be a lot that the international courts could learn from other court systems. Take our own in England, for example, and I think in this respect, much like other systems, we used to have processes whereby judges who wield a great deal of power and were very important people would be literally tapped on the shoulder. That was the phrase, tapped on the shoulder. Somebody would say, would you like to be a judge? And if the network of friendships and so on would work, and that person would become a judge. No longer. Not for a long time. To become a judge, there is an independent commission that examines you, sometimes without even knowing who you are, probably by paper references, and in all sorts of ways deals with the appointment objectively to make sure that they're getting the right quality of judge, the right qualifications and so on. And all countries are doing the same thing, not just in the judiciary, but not in the United Nations, where judges are elected. And sometimes the judges are really good, and sometimes they are not really good. Sometimes they're appointed because they actually are good at the job. Sometimes they're appointed maybe for other reasons. And so the international courts and the politicians who create them should say, we have to, once we create one of these things, we have to let it go, and we have to have systems derived from around the world. There are many other examples I could give that will make them the best they can be and the freest of all forms of influence. And in the course of that, the greatest access to material, evidence of all kinds, must be afforded to defendants as well as to prosecutors. That's another important element.
Thank you for the great lecture. I am happy to be here. I have two questions here.
There you are. Hi.
I have two questions. The first one is about Milosevic and the process of the trial. Do you think that the process of his trial would have been different if it wasn't for the self-representation?
If it wasn't for the self-representation, yeah.
Yes, and the second, adding on what Professor Ismet said earlier, what is your stance on the special chambers? What do you say to people thinking that the creation of special chambers is a result of Hague Tribunal's failure? Thank you.
A result of?
Hague Tribunal's failure.
Aha. On the first question, would you like to answer the first question? No? His representing himself served your question can be answered very simply. If he had not been represented, would it have been different? Yes. How different? Very. Depending on who he had representing him. My view is it would have been, from a lawyer's point of view, a challenging but interesting case to defend, and a skilled defender would have done almost none of the things that Milosevic did and done everything differently. He or she would have allowed nearly all the evidence of the terrible killings and so on that happened in, allow them to be read, get them in as quickly as possible, and then challenge the prosecution to say, and where is your evidence that my client, who I'm privileged to represent, or you can imagine the lawyer saying it, where's the evidence that this man has got anything to do with this? And if that had happened, we wouldn't have been without a very strong case, but we would have been probably in much more difficulties, because a great deal of the evidence that we got came in the course of the 4-year trial. And it came because people could see one witness having the confidence to give evidence, and they turned up and then said, okay, well, we'll give evidence. Some very important people from Kosovo actually took that position. And that's another reality of these trials. Who wants to be the first person to put their hand up against very powerful defendants? But once you've seen other people do it, so if he'd had a skillful professional defender, then I think the case would have been collapsed into a shorter period of time. He would have been presented as a statesman facing difficulties rather than the man who, as we were able to show with that Kula camp video, that's the video that shows him setting up the Red Berets in 1991, was actually a man with a criminal intent. Very different. In the event, because he represented himself, he showed himself up. He showed himself to be quite cruel, sometimes with very ordinary, not ordinary, with witnesses who'd suffered, really. He couldn't bring himself not to treat them with disdain, with wholly inappropriate approaches. As to the other question about the specialist chambers, it is being dealt with again this afternoon at 5 o'clock. I think that's probably the better time to answer these questions. Is it a reflection of the failure of the Hague Tribunal? I suspect that the creation of the specialist chambers is a more complicated, more complex happening or event than simply that. But more maybe later.
Ju falenderoj shumë për këtë ligjëratë mrekullueshme, besoj që gjithë kemi përfituar. Gjithashtu dëshiroj të ju bëj me dije dhe ta falenderoj edhe një herë Sir Geoffrey Nice se është ardhur plotësisht falas për këtë ligjëratë këtu në Fakultetin Juridik. Falenderoj gjithashtu prezencën e profesoreshës Nena Trump, që nuk pat rast për shkak të pyetjeve të shumta drejtuar Sir Geoffrey Nice-it. po ne së bashku me Fesin, që na kanë ndihmuar këtë organizim, do ta kemi edhe një ngjarje tjetër në ora 5 në atë restoranin Orion, është qendër e konferencave dhe aty në vërtet pjesëmarrës nuk do të jenë student, po do të jenë pjesëtar të shoqërisë civile, të partive politike, do të ketë edhe gazetar. I falenderoj gjithashtu mediat, po dëgjoj prej mesazheve që i marr që kjo ligjëratë ka qenë live, kështu që edhe studentë që s'kan pas mundësi të jenë këtu, me qenë se sot është e premte, kanë pas mundësi drejt për drejt me e përcjell ligjëratën. Këtu me ne do të jetë gjithashtu në këtë tryezën e rrumbullakt në ora 5, është edhe zonja Sonja Biserko, që gjithashtu ka dhënë një kontribut të madh për paqë, jo vetëm të ne, po gjithkund në botë, dhe ne jemi të nderuar edhe me prezencën e saj që kemi musafir këtu. Ju faleminderit shumë dhe me pafshim në ngjarje tjetër.